Hello birdcrafters, welcome to something a little bit different from the norm. We're going to be looking at the whales and dolphins, and in this case we're looking at the whales and dolphins of the British Isles, and in particular in this talk we're going to be looking at what we call the true whales. I'll go more into that in a moment or two. I hope you enjoy the presentation. It perhaps gives you a taste of what you could see in and around the UK waters in the coming months and years once COVID has finally abated. I think most people, their first thought and their first association with whales probably comes from something like Moby Dick, which features a whale that trashes the whalers' ships. And what it doesn't really tell you is that it's not really a whale, it's a toothed whale, so not what we're calling the true whales. It's actually a member of the Odontoceti. In this talk we're going to concentrate on another type of whale called the Mystaceti, and the Mystaceti sometimes referred to as the baleen whales or the whalebone whales, whichever you prefer. Commercial whaling officially stopped in 1982. Of course it didn't really, but at least in the UK's case we have stopped whaling. We've been stopped whaling a couple of decades earlier. In 1963 was the last time a British whaling ship set sail and killed a whale. Since then, the Whaling Commission have allowed what's called scientific whaling for the likes of Iceland and Japan, Norway and one or two others. This is a nonsense, of course. It's not scientific in any way. It's actually commercial, but it's just hidden under another guise. Suffice to say, though, most of what we still know about whales comes from the whaling industry. What I tell you in the next half an hour or so may change because we're getting new information all the time. For instance, how many species of true whale are there? Well, I can't actually give you an honest answer on that other than to tell you that roughly there are 14 species of whale, most of which we're going to discuss today. Humans have had a long fascination with whales, presumably because of their gigantic size. And here's an illustration of that. In 1884, this big humpback whale, 40 feet long, washes up on the banks of the Tay and creates a sensation. The whale caused a sensation in the local press, and William McGonagall, the famous poet, well, when I say famous, he was famous for being a terrible poet, was so moved by its occurrence that he wrote this poem, The Tay Whale. Currently, Japan is probably the most contentious whaling nation, although I don't know why they've got that accolade, because Norway is just as bad, and the Faroes and so on and so forth. But just to give you some idea of how mad whaling is, the latest industry figures for Japan, which are several years out of date now, it requires at least 30 million US dollars annually just to break even on the whaling side of things, whereas whale watching actually generates money for Japan, at least 22 million US dollars back in 2008, and it's grown at 6% per annum. So you can figure that that's going to be vastly more worthy financially than actually whaling. So there's got to be other reasons why the whaling industry in Japan continues to this day. Whale watching in the UK hasn't yet reached large-scale proportions. There's no reason why it shouldn't. There are plenty of whales and dolphins to be watched around UK waters, but it is a growing industry in the UK, and as whale and dolphin stocks recover, there's a chance that the numbers of whales will be so great that it will be viable for industries in several different parts of the UK. If we take a look at the seabed structure around the UK, you can see that mostly, for the greater part certainly, the shelf is extensive, and most of the areas where whales and dolphins occur in the UK are in relatively shallow waters. We don't really have any accessible deep water areas which would enable us to get close to some of the more esoteric species, those ocean-going species that we'd rarely get sight of. Having said that, there are plenty of whales and dolphins reasonably close to shore around the UK, and there are some fantastic watch points, which we could discuss at some point as well. So the UK does have a wealth of dolphins and whales at its doorstep, and so do not think about having to go to British Columbia or to Australia or South Africa or wherever to see whales and dolphins. They're right on our doorstep. If we look back through the paleontological record at the diversification of whales, you can see that it stretches back some 50 million years to the likes of a strange little creature called Pachycetus, a land-based creature that went into the ocean, and it evolved over a period of years to the point where 34 million years ago there was a distinct occurrence of what we now call the crown whales, and they split to become the toothed whales on one side, which is basically the dolphins, and the baleen whales on the other side, and they're the whalebone whales or the true whales. The Mystaceti or baleen whales are named after the whalebone that hangs like a fringe from the mouth and acts as a sieve, a very effective way of collecting some of the smallest creatures in the ocean in large enough quantities to feed some of the very largest. A very effective way of feeding called filter feeding, lunge feeding, a variety of different things that you can see from different whale species, but effective, no teeth, and very clearly different structures to that of the beaked whales and the dolphins. Baleen, or whalebone, has long been used by humans as a product, and probably the most famous use of it is in the creation of corsets. And there may be one or two of you in the audience who've actually worn a corset at some point in time. I know for sure that Owen is rarely without his. The reason it was used was because it has a very strong tensile ability to the baleen, but it's also rather springy and rather elastic, so it was allowing the cinching in of the waist on the corset. The northern minke whale is by far the commonest species of Mystaceti or true whale that occurs around UK waters. It's not that easy to spot, partly because it is not very demonstrative most of the time, keeps relatively low in the water, and you'd be easily forgiven for thinking you've just spotted a bottlenose dolphin if this was all you saw of a minke whale. I mean, that dorsal fin sure does look like a bottlenose dolphin's dorsal fin, and your chances of spotting them increase greatly as you go further north in the UK, up around the Scottish Islands, but they do occur off Cornwall in numbers as well. It's a temperate water species, certainly in the summer months, and there are literally thousands of them around UK waters, but they are not accessible to us most of the time. I mentioned a little earlier how the baleen whales, sometimes referred to as rorqual whales, how they seem to feed mainly on crustacea, things like krill, but it's not the case with this whale, the minke whale. It's feeding on schooling fish. How did the whale get its name? Minke is a strange name, well, thought to be mainly Minkval, Norwegian, named after possibly a Norwegian whaler who got it wrong, called Menke, who mistook a northern minke whale for a blue whale, and basically they took the minke out of him. So, you know, how do you mistake the smallest whale in the ocean for the biggest? Only a fool surely could do that. Let's just take a look at the topography of a whale, because knowing where to look and identify a whale from those particular features is critical to success. Let's start with the dorsal fin, which is probably the bit that you see more frequently than anything else, although of course not all whales have dorsal fins, and that in itself may be a way of identifying it. But the dorsal fin on a minke whale is pretty small in comparison to the rest of the animal. It's around about the same size as I mentioned before, a bottlenose dolphin's dorsal fin, and certainly a minke whale is 3 or 4 times larger than a bottlenose dolphin. The back end of the whale, where the tail is, the flukes are a very important feature. Whether a whale actually flukes or lifts its flukes out of the water when it arches its back and dives under can be a critical way of identifying that whale. For instance, in the case of minke whale, They don't lift their flukes out of the water when they dive. The pectoral fins on a minke whale are very distinctive. That white band is one of the best ways of identifying a minke whale, but of course if the whale stays under the water for the majority of the time and certainly only shows the top bit of it, you'll be lucky to see that. However, if they start breaching, then you might get a good look at it. The blowhole is a very important feature, and on the Mr. SETI there are two holes at the top there, just like yours and mine's nostril, only it's on top of the head. They've got a double blowhole. The Odonta SETI, things like the dolphins, they have a single hole. And if you look underneath the whale, the ventral grooves, those pleats, they're designed to expand to allow the whale to engulf its prey, exclude the water, and then swallow down the food. And the tip of the whale is referred to as the rostrum, and it can vary in shape and in proportion to the length of the head. There are a number of places around the UK where minke whales can be reliably seen and watched. The famous ones probably are off Mull and off the Gairloch area up in Scotland, but also off Cornwall. You can find them quite readily, and quite recently there's also been a lot of evidence of minke whales in and around the Farne Islands, the trough off the Farnes there, known as the Farne Deep. And so there are other areas now starting to come on stream which allow for reliable minke whale watching in the UK. And one of the things that comes out of that is that you discover that minke whales, just like you and I, are individually identifiable. And most of the ways in which the minke whales are identified are through their various notches and grooves and damage on their dorsal fins, because that's very often all you get to see of the whale. So if you see a minke whale, take a photograph of the dorsal fin. There's probably a catalogue somewhere to help you identify that individual. Minke whales regularly breach, though not with the same habitual nature that it happens with humpbacks. But when they do so, they do reveal that band on the flipper, which makes it easy to identify them. Once they start, they may go on for many minutes, lunging out of the water and crashing back in. We still really don't know what the breaching is about in truth. It may have multi-functions. It could be to dislodge parasites. It could be a communication system between whales. It could be a number of different things. It could just be simply for the joy of it. But luckily they do, and they reveal all those key features when they do it. And I've been lucky enough to see it 2 or 3 times, and certainly if you go up into the Minch area on a calm day, you've got a very good chance of spotting a minke whale at some distance breaching in the blue water. Here's the distribution of minke whale in the UK waters. You can see there's big concentration actually in the North Sea, and another big concentration again in the Minch area that I mentioned before, and there's also big concentrations off South and Southwest Islands, and strangely there's a lack of records off the Cornish coastline, and I think that's a serious under-recording issue, because I've been in those waters many times and there are lots of minke whales there, so that's got to be a human bias thing, I think. The sei whale, or sei whale, doesn't matter how you say it, they're both correct, is the next step up in size from the minke whale in terms of a UK context. This is a big old whale though, it's not a minke in size or stature at all. This thing can get to 15 metres in length, and that's a sizable beast. And one of the things that you will notice about sei whale or sei whale, if ever you get the chance to see one, believe you me, you'll be lucky, it's a very enigmatic thing in these northern waters, is that it has got a very tall dorsal fin, and mostly that is probably the only way you're going to be able to positively identify this particular whale. I took this particular photograph off Chile. It really does show the tall falcate shape of the dorsal fin, and it's got a distinct hook at the top of it. Now it does vary a fair bit, but it's this rather upright look of it and then swept over at the top that really makes you think you're looking at a sei whale or sei whale, as opposed to a fin whale that has got a quite different fin structure. And one of the things about sei whale or sei whale is that they have different feeding strategies, and we'll look at that in a moment. One of the things that you will notice about a sei whale or sei whale, I'll keep saying it, is that they have a slightly different way of surfacing and descending compared to fin whale. They tend to sort of drop below the water a bit more rather than arching over, so you'll often get the splash guard visible at the same time as the dorsal fin, although that's not what you're seeing here because there's actually two different whales in this picture. What I will say is that their feeding strategies vary quite considerably depending on what they're feeding on. They mainly feed on the daytime at quite deep depths, where they'll be using a kind of sieving technique similar to the right whales as they cruise along, whereas at other times they'll come close to the surface and they'll be lunge feeding at the surface. So it will vary what they do. They're quite adaptable in that sense. In comparison to fin whales, they're much scarcer in northern waters than the fin whale appears to be, but it may just be the fact that they are further offshore and maybe not observed as much, or it could be any number of factors that are behind that, or maybe it is just a rarer, scarcer whale in total. Anyway, let's have a look at the distribution. As you'll see from this graphic here, there's a concentration of sei whale sightings to the west of Shetland, between there and the Faroes, which is probably associated with what's called the Shetland Faroes Trough. And there are one or two other sightings elsewhere, including in the Celtic Sea. But I don't know, I think a lot of this is misidentification with fin whale, because they are really hard to separate. Anno and I have watched sei whales a number of times in different localities, including in the likes of the Bay of Biscay, and believe you me, it takes some doing separating out a sei whale from a fin whale, so I would wonder if a lot of this is due to misidentification. The largest whale that you're ever likely to see in UK waters is the fin whale. It's a big beast. In northern waters they can get to something like 23 meters in length. And that translates to something close to 89 feet as a maximum. It's a bit unusual in coloration and pattern is the fin whale. If you look at this particular graphic here, you can see that the right hand side of the jaw, is lower jaw at least, is pale whitish colour, whereas on the left side you can see it's dark and completely opposite in terms of coloration. And weirdly, the baleen, which you can't obviously see in this image, is the opposite. So it's a very curious thing, that, and it must have a function, otherwise it wouldn't be there, but I'm not sure that we know what the function actually is. The fin whale is so large that as it comes towards the surface it creates a bow wave, and it's not uncommon to see dolphins riding the bow wave or bow wave of a fin whale. You can see this whale's just about to blow here as it breaks the surface, and you can see those pectoral fins sticking out at the side. I actually photographed this particular whale from one of the Biscay ferries. I've been fortunate enough to see hundreds of fin whales. Most of them in northern waters have been in Biscay, and I've seen them off various other parts of the world. And I've seen this particular whale off the Scottish coast up near Triumphant Head, which was the first time I'd ever seen a fin whale in UK waters. That was only a year or so ago. And then on the same trip we ended up going through the Shetland Trough, and there were dozens of them in the Shetland Trough. So it's not necessarily an uncommon species in UK waters. A dramatic thing when you do actually come to see one. They can occasionally breach. They don't tend to breach, but they will occasionally breach. And there are very slim profile to the fin whale. Like all of the whales that we've been looking at so far, they are rorqual whales, and they have rorqual-like blows, which means they are tall and columnar in shape, and they can get up to 10 meters in height. They blow on this particular whale. This is one of the favourite images I've ever taken of a fin whale. You can see the swirl over the back there, which is one of the features of fin whale coloration, but that's not why I like this photograph. If you look really carefully, down at the very bottom of the picture in the centre, there is a tiny bird. It is a Wilson's storm petrel, and that gives you an idea of the scale and the size and the monstrous hugeness of a fin whale. They are a mighty impressive beast. I think it's time we concentrated on really what is the key feature of identifying a fin whale. It's actually the dorsal fin itself. If you can think back for a moment to that sei whale with its rather erect dorsal fin, this one is very swept back. It's almost like it's a ski slope running off the back of the animal, and it's a very distinctly different angle shape to that of sei whale or minke whale, and it's very, very particular to fin whale. Even though the size of the fin can actually vary slightly, the actual positioning and shape is very distinctive. So let's have a look at the distribution. You can see that Shetland trough area between Faroes and Shetland again is really showing up as a hot spot. I can personally testify to that. And then there's down the shelf edge, the drop-off zone along the west side of Ireland. You can see there's quite a concentration there as well. They do actually like to feed off the drop-off zone. That's one of the main feeding localities, and certainly if you ever go down to Biscay, that's where you're looking for them. Southwest Ireland, you can see there's a small concentration down there, and that tends to be during the winter period. And of course, not that long ago, we had a yearling male turn up on the D'Estuary. It died sadly in the end, but I don't think the occurrences in the Irish Sea are as rare as this graphic makes out, because I know there are a number of records been seen off the Isle of Man, for instance. So you do have a reasonable chance of seeing fin whale in UK waters, and if they continue to recover from the whaling, they're still a long way off full recovery. If they continue to recover, then there's a chance that this is going to become a much more regular feature in UK waters in years to come. And so we come to the biggest of the baleen or rorqual whales, the blue whale. Does it really occur in UK waters? The truth is a bit equivocal, because we have sound recordings of blue whales that have been recorded from UK listening stations that they can clearly hear blue whales, and they must be reasonably close, within a couple of 100 miles of shore at the very most, but they don't get seen. And yet they get seen in Biscay, and they get seen up in Iceland, and they get seen above the Norwegian coast up towards Svalbard. So they have to be coming in very close to UK waters, and I would think your best chance of catching up with one is going to be that Shetland trough. The term Leviathan just makes you think of something enormous, and a blue whale is just that. This graphic just shows you that it takes 40 elephants to make a single blue whale, and 2,667 humans only weigh as much as a single blue whale. The bit on the graphic that really I think demonstrates how big they are is when you see a humpback illustrated against a blue whale, and then you realise just how big a big blue whale actually gets. And a big blue whale is almost certainly female, because in the Mysticeti the females are considerably bigger in some species than the males, and it's universal amongst the Mysticeti that the females are going to be the largest. And a blue whale is the biggest thing that has ever lived in our oceans, and continues to do so to this day. They are simply enormous. The search for blue whales in UK waters goes on unabated, and a couple of years back the Daily Telegraph blew this trumpet about a blue whale being photographed in English seas for the first time in waters off Cornwall, and there was an image showing a blue whale, and it was There's massive splash guard on it, all that kind of. It was undoubtedly a blue whale, but when they showed you exactly the location of the whale, I struggled with that concept that it was UK waters. And here's the graphic that they showed dictating exactly where the blue whale had been sighted on the 24th of August 2017. And unless my eyes are deceiving me, I'd swear that that whale is a lot closer to France than it is to England. I just wonder if this is why we ended up losing the vote on Brexit. This is the kind of mentality where we think we're bigger than we are. So how do you actually spot a whale in UK waters? Well, you could go on a specialist trip, but they're usually very expensive and they don't get very far offshore. Or you could take a cruise liner, but that's very, very expensive. So you could opt for something in between. You could try one of the ferries, and certainly North Sea ferries and the Biscay ferries and other ferries across to Ireland do actually cut across waters where you'll see whales and dolphins. And they're definitely worth thinking about. And this one photograph here was taken on the old Biscay Pride of Bilbao ferry, and it just showed you what was possible on that particular route. So yeah, get on a boat, get on a ship, and you will see whales in and around UK waters. The last whale that I'm going to feature today is humpback whale. It's one that was described by Herman Melville as the gamesome whale, and it certainly is a demonstrative whale. It jumps, it leaps, it twists, it splashes, it turns, it does all kinds of things to demonstrate that it is a humpbacked whale. And it had been annihilated and eliminated from UK waters, but its recovery from whaling is well underway. Still massively long way to go before it gets back to its pre-whaling numbers. But because of that increase, we're starting to see it regularly in and around UK waters. There was one seen off Liverpool not that long ago. But if you really want to see one in UK waters, there are a couple of reliable locations. One is the Moray Firth during the winter period, where several whales are these days spending winter. And the other is in the south end of the Minch and up towards Triumphant Head in the Minch itself, and whales tend to be there up until mid-June to early July from the late winter period onwards. So there's a chance you could see humpback whale in UK waters, and so far I've not been lucky personally. I've seen humpbacks all over the world, but I've not seen one in UK waters, so that's something to look forward to. And these photographs were not taken in UK waters therefore, but they were as close as I could get on this occasion, which was off the Canaries. Humpbacks have a number of distinctive features, and for individual recognition, generally, apart from the dorsal fin shape, the most distinctive element is the underside of the fluke, which has a pattern that is reminiscent of the pattern that you'll see on your individualized fingerprints. Every whale has a different pattern of white and black on the underside. There are catalogues, and if you get a good image of one like this, you can actually identify the individual from the catalogues. The pectoral fins of humpback whales are entirely distinctive. Nothing has a pectoral fin quite like it, up to 18 feet in length, and the whole whales can get to 65 feet in length. That knobbly front edge to the pectoral fin, which they will slap into the water at regular intervals. And as you can see, it's very white. The whales, humpback whales of northern waters, do tend to have these very white pectoral fins, which is quite different to the whales in the southern oceans, where they've got quite dark fins. So in regional variation in their patterns. If you're lucky enough to see whales regularly, you'll get used to the way that the blow varies from species to species. The rorqual whales in general have got tall, thin columnar blows, as I mentioned, whereas humpbacks, when they blow, they tend to look a bit bushier and shorter, fatter looking blows than you see from the likes of a blue whale or a fin whale. The knobbles on the head of the humpback whale, well, nobody's quite sure what the function of those is. It must have some useful function, otherwise they wouldn't have them. But it's unknown precisely what the purpose of those knobbles actually is. It could be something to do with competition between animals, fighting, who knows. Certainly it's a distinctive feature on the animal. Humpback whales have immense migrations from the Arctic and Antarctic waters where they spend their summers, and then they will go for a winter period to the tropics, where they will calve and where they will also breed. So they are incredible migrants that pass UK waters as they go from Norway on their way to the Caribbean waters, for instance. But you won't see one of the most exciting parts of a humpback's life in UK waters, which is the heat run. This is the sort of mating competition that goes on, and in this particular image here you can see several whales gathered, and in a heat run the males are barging each other and trying to get prime position with the female, and she will basically run the males into a lather, and she will be left with the fittest male to mate with her, or she might just leave and go off her own merry way. So this graphic backs up to an extent what I was saying before about humpbacks occurring in UK waters, although there's a bit of underplaying of what's going on in terms of the Moray Firth area, and certainly you can't see much evidence of red dots in the Minch and Sea of Hebrides, and I think that's because this is a developing situation. The humpback's still recovering from the days of whaling, and it's starting to reoccupy its former haunts. And so as the population just slowly increases, we're seeing more and more humpbacks in UK waters, and it's a situation, so long as whaling doesn't make a filthy return, that's going to keep increasing, and I just can't wait for the day when I personally see my very first UK humpback. If you want to know more about whales and dolphins in the UK waters, there's a few different books available, and of course there's always the internet, and here's a few for your delight to have a look through and find and steal and borrow and beg, whichever is your preference. Now, I would strongly recommend that you have a look at the one at the bottom there, which is the Mark Carwardine's Guide to Whale Watching in Britain and Europe. It's probably the best resource in terms of knowing where to watch around UK waters, but there are many other sources available. I haven't given you an exhaustive look at the whales that have been recorded in UK waters because some of them are just so rare it's just not worth it. Brudus whale, which you see on the left here, is potentially spottable in UK waters, as particularly now that we've got global warming occurring, and certainly one turned up off the Normandy coast this year and actually ended up washing up ashore. So it could potentially turn up in UK waters. You've got northern right whale, which is pretty much extinct in the East Atlantic. You'd be very hard pressed to see one of those, so I won't dwell on those. But there is so much going on in the whale watching world around the UK that it is a great opportunity to get to grips with some of the most fascinating and certainly some of the largest animals on the planet. So I thought I'd finish with just a few items. Here's a few fascinating facts. For instance, it says there are 89 species on this graphic, but in fact, you look in Mark Carwardine's latest book, it says there are 90, and that's because we're in a bit of a state of flux. You know, it's lumping and splitting going on, new species being discovered and species going extinct, as happened with the Yangtze river dolphin quite recently. It says here the fastest cetacean is the Atlantic white-sided dolphin, and it occurs in UK waters, and I'll discuss that next time. Some beaked whales can hold their breath for over 2 hours, and some of us can only hold our breath for 2 or 3 minutes, so that puts that in context. And the longest lived animal is the bowhead whale, extending to over 200 years at least. We do not know what the upper limit is because we haven't been testing it effectively for that long. My favourite one is the whale with the largest testes, which is of course the northern right whale. They weigh a magnificent 910 kilograms. That must be down to something like competitive mating situation. And I always like the question that gets asked to me is, how do you identify a northern right whale? And I just say they're the ones with the biggest underpants. And when it comes to migrations, I mentioned before about the humpback. Well, it vies with the grey whale, which occurs off the west side of North America in terms of the long distance migration. things are changing all the time. We've started having the odd grey whale turn up in Atlantic waters, and that may be because of the recession of the Arctic ice. So watch out for that. They may be on your list before you know it. And finally, on that point, in terms of whaling and watching whales, whale watching generates over $2 billion annually. It is a big business, and I think I've possibly contributed a significant proportion to that. If you do go on a whale watch, then please make sure you take part in what is referred to as sustainable and responsible whale watching. There are some rogue operators out there. They tend to be the ones that hassle the whales, head straight for them, cut them off, all that kind of stuff. If ever you see that, don't go with them. It's easy enough to find out who is signed up to the Good Whale Watch program. Just go onto the various whale watching websites and you will soon work out who's the good guys and who are the rogues. So please be aware of that. The UK in general is a very whale friendly nation these days. Here's a number of organisations dedicated to watching, recording and conserving whales, not just in UK waters but around the world, and I'd recommend you explore all of them, not making any distinction between them. They're all great. I'm going to leave you with this thought. Every time you watch a whale, that whale is paying back some financial reward into our lives. It keeps doing it throughout its life. If somebody kills a whale, that is a one-off payment, and a whale that keeps giving and giving through whale watching is going to be far more valuable than a dead whale. And if you can keep making that argument, eventually the financial argument will win out, and eventually at some point, hopefully in my lifetime, Japan, Iceland, Norway and all the others will see the light and realise that whale watching is far more rewarding than whale killing.